Everything is a little more complicated when the group in charge is a designated terrorist organization. That's kind of the gist of this video. So let's dive into some updates around what's going on in Syria. Starting with some news that Ukraine had operators on the ground in Syria assisting HTS in the weeks leading up to their offensive against the Assad regime. This was just published in the Washington Post, and all articles and people that I reference throughout this video will be linked in the description below. So this article says, quote, Ukrainian intelligence sent around 20 experienced drone operators and around 150 first-person viewed drones to the rebel headquarters in Idlib, Syria, 4 to 5 weeks ago to help HTS in their coming offensive against the Assad regime. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that is the group leading the opposition in this recent charge of the last couple weeks to topple the Assad regime. The issue there, HTS, designated terrorist organization. So you have Ukraine, a U.S. ally, an ally to a lot of countries around the world, and a lot of those countries view HTS as a terrorist organization. No matter how you view the end state here, that's thin ice for Ukraine to be walking on. Now, I shared a video about a week ago showing kind of the drone school that HTS had put together, and in that video, I said, you know, there had been speculation that Ukraine had forces on the ground, and I said, you don't actually have to do that. You could probably learn just as much from viewing videos like this and videos coming out of the war in Ukraine. I was wrong. Looks like Ukraine actually did put people on the ground in Syria, which is surprising for a couple of reasons. One of them, how do you get there? Seems like a difficult region for Ukraine to infill some of their military personnel. But either way, diving into the rest of the article here, they say the Kyiv Post in a June 3rd article quoted a source in the Ukrainian military intelligence service that, quote, since the beginning of the year, the Syrian rebels, supported by Ukrainian operatives, have inflicted numerous strikes on Russian military facilities represented in the region, end quote. They say before the HTS offensive toppled Assad, Russian officials had asserted that Ukraine's link with the rebel group was an attempt to recruit Syrian fighters for its war against the Kremlin. A September report in an online site called The Cradle alleged that Ukraine had offered 75 unmanned aerial vehicles in a drones for fighter program with HTS, but there isn't any independent evidence to back this Russian claim. That feels a little Russian propaganda, if you will. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Look, Ukraine does need personnel, but what are the numbers they're going to get from this, right? If it's 1-to-1, that's nothing. Even 10-to-1, 750 fighters, is that really going to do much? We'll go 100-to-1, right? 7,500 new fighters showing up from HTS, which is probably more than they actually had that they could contribute. Showing up in Ukraine, Lord knows how they actually get there. And then speaking a different language, and they're coming from a group that has historic ties to Al-Qaeda, just doesn't really seem like a first step that Ukraine would take for a lot of reasons. Also, again, worth pointing out, there's no evidence to back that up at this point. But it does seem like Russia is kind of downplaying the Ukrainian role in all of this. They say Russia clearly was surprised by HTS's rapid advance on Damascus, but interestingly, Russian sources have tried to minimize the Ukrainian role. A December 2nd article in Middle East Eye quoted a Russian Telegram account said to reflect the views of the Russian military that discounted Kyiv's assistance. Quote, firstly, GUR members did visit Idlib, but they stayed there only for a short time, not enough to train Syrians to operate unmanned aerial vehicles from scratch. Secondly, HTS had long had its own UAV program. And that's a little bit, I think I'm about to agree with a Russian propagandist take here. That's a little bit what I was getting at, is this isn't like a new idea. It is new technology, but a lot of it can be learned over videos. But I wanted to bring that up because it is kind of interesting how Russia has portrayed Ukraine in a lot of different ways in recent years, where they're kind of this like Schrodinger's Ukraine, where they're both a failed state constantly on the verge of collapse, but Ukraine is also at the same time everywhere and an international player affecting regime change in Syria against Russian interests. Like, it's been kind of interesting to watch that dichotomy. Now, of course, this isn't the only time that we've seen Ukraine involved in international affairs against Russian interests. The BBC reported in August that Ukraine had helped rebels in northern Mali to ambush Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group. Andrei Yusov, a GUR spokesman, touted the Mali operation several days later, saying that the Malian rebels, quote, received necessary information and not just information, which enabled a successful military operation against Russian war criminals. According to the BBC, after the attack is when Mali severed diplomatic relations with Ukraine. Now, this kind of brings about the conversation of different types of threats, and this is a very real argument for people in the national security space. In this exact example, you have near-peer adversary, in this case, Russia, and then you have non-state actors, in this case, HTS. You can tie that back to Al-Qaeda or just broadly Salafi jihadism, anything like that. And the question there is, what is more of a risk to the United States today? What's more of a threat to the United States and our interests at home and abroad? And there's people a lot smarter than me that make very valid arguments every single day how either one of those is more important or more of a threat than the other in today's current environment. I imagine you're going to see some of that same argument playing out here, but either way, any overt ties to a designated terrorist organization is a pretty risky move to take here by Ukraine. Now, they might not be a designated terrorist organization for long. There has been a lot of talk here in the United States that that designation might be removed here and maybe elsewhere. There's going to be movement towards that, which is interesting. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken put out a statement yesterday saying, quote, "The transition process and new government must also uphold clear commitments to fully respect the rights of minorities, facilitate the flow of humanitarian assistance to all in need, prevent Syria from being used as a base for terrorism or posing a threat to its neighbors, and ensure that any chemical or biological weapon stockpiles are secured and safely destroyed." Honestly, not a crazy checklist for HTS to hit here. The first, they're already talking the talk and partially walking the walk on respecting the rights of minorities. Facilitating the flow of humanitarian aid, it's hard to see HTS pushing back against that as they try to rebuild portions of Syria. No indications they're going to try to shut that off. Preventing Syria from being used as a base for terrorism. They've already kind of done that in Idlib, and it does seem like that's one of the reasons that HTS severed ties with Al-Qaeda back in 2017, was to say, hey, we're more of a nationalist organization. We don't really have the same desire to get after this global type jihad. So maybe in terms of posing a threat to its neighbors, I think that's in the eye of the beholder. We'll have to see how that plays out. And then ensuring that any chemical or biological weapon stockpiles are secured and safely destroyed. Haven't heard a lot about that really at all at this point. Technically, you might tie in some of the Israeli strikes into Syria, and we'll get into that in a moment, in that category, but it's not clear that Israel was destroying any, and I don't think Israel's even said this, that they've been going after chemical or biological weapon stockpiles. So that seems like something that's been almost entirely unaddressed at this point. Now, shifting over to some domestic issues inside of Syria, there was a new article put out by Shiraz Maher titled, "Syria's Rebels Won the War. Can They Win the Peace?" And of course, this will be linked in the description below. In that article, they say Jolani put out a statement saying, quote, "We must adhere to the ethics of victory, be a role model of tolerance and forgiveness. Today, we are working day and night for the future Syria, the Syria that will be a country of justice, dignity, and freedom for all Syrians." Again, they're saying Jolani and HTS have and continue to say all of the right things. I want to stress in this video, and I'll continue to stress, we have to judge them based off of their actions. So they know what to say, and part of the reason there is Jolani has learned to be pretty pragmatic in his time leading the organization. The article continues saying, quote, "For years now, the group has tried to demonstrate both its willingness and ability to accommodate Syria's minorities, whose fate has long been a source of contention. While the early rebels failed to build meaningful alliances with minorities, Jolani has shown he is far shrewder and more pragmatic than his counterparts." He's not stupid. And I think that's something that we struggle with at times in looking at some of these non-state actors, jihadi organizations, and we think they're dumb. They're learning as they go. Jolani, you don't move from Iraq and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, kind of through Islamic State to a degree, to Al-Qaeda, to Nusra, to HTS, leading these organizations in some of the most volatile areas in the entire world by being an idiot, right? The guy knows what he's doing to a degree, and I think that's probably what we're seeing play out here. However, that is kind of the rosy side, the optimistic side. We have to be realistic here. They say, yet many remain skeptical of what Jolani can achieve and just how far his edicts will be adhered to at local levels. As HTS forces marched into Marada, an area of Hama that is home to a large Christian population, the majority of residents elected to flee. This happened despite Jolani addressing them through a dedicated communication to reassure them that they will be protected, citing the experience of their counterparts in Idlib and Aleppo. So that is happening. Now, we haven't seen any wide-scale execution, murder, torture of ethnic or religious minorities in Syria, and more on that, unfortunately, kind of sliding in the wrong direction here in a moment. But there are still plenty of people in Syria that are nervous about this. At the same time, we do have long lines of people moving into Syria for the first time in a decade plus, coming back because they're optimistic that things could be better. And they say this type of approach has earned Jolani the scorn and derision of other jihadists who regard him as having lost his way. In its weekly newsletter known as Al-Naba, ISIS slammed HTS for pursuing a nationalist agenda and laments its decision to, quote, coexist with pagan and esoteric minorities. So look, generally speaking, if Islamic State doesn't like somebody, that's a good sign for us in the West, like a step in the right direction. So this is the complication that is Jolani and HTS. You got the extreme groups that don't like him, and then you've got some groups like the Christians in that town in Hama that just said, we're not going to risk it, we're going to get out of here. So again, it's going to be words, not actions here. And one thing the article here kind of ended with was saying that, Idlib was not some pristine wonderland where everybody got along just fine under HTS. They say in the first quarter of 2023 alone, the group HTS is accused of carrying out 19 extrajudicial killings. The previous year, 30 people are estimated to have been killed in a similar fashion. Still a pretty rough organization, right? And I think that's worth diving into some of the atrocities and executions that we're starting to see play out now in Syria. They are starting to trickle out more and more. Look, it would have been shocking if this number was 0. It was nice that the number was at the very least low for a couple days there. What I'm seeing right now are a lot of individual cases where it seemed, maybe an individual grudge or an individual soldier acting out or a small group of soldiers acting out. It doesn't look institutionalized right now, if that makes sense. Really what I'm trying to get at is it doesn't seem like there's any HTS or Jolani directed violence at certain groups. It feels like it's much lower, possibly even soldiers kind of going rogue. Now, according to Charles Lister, a Syria expert, he said, quote, the HTS-led coalition announced a 100% amnesty for all Syrian soldiers, conscripts, and reservists. They also declared that all borders with Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq to be open for refugee returns. That's huge. That's actually really, really important for Syrian soldiers, as we're going to get into more of these individual cases of extrajudicial killings that are starting to come out. So I don't know what the exact right number would be here, but there's a lot of examples of Syrian soldiers being forced into service. So yes, they may have been wearing the uniform of the Assad regime, but do not look at every one of those as somebody willingly fighting for Assad or against the people of Syria. So it's a good thing, possibly a positive step for a brighter future for the overall country, that those soldiers are being granted 100% amnesty. They can come back to the table and rejoin Syrian society. Now, HTS leader Jolani also issued a decree saying that those involved in torturing and executing prisoners would be sought after, including those who fled the country. And it looks like that's already happening. We've got some pictures and videos starting to come out showing that guards from the Syria prison, which has been referred to as a human slaughterhouse, have been hunted down, captured, and maybe a few of them, depending on the different footage, if it's authentic or taken from somewhere else, they may have already been executed. Their information, the guards, they fled the prison before the opposition forces got there, but guard rosters, personnel data, stuff like that was released, and it sounds like they're being hunted down now. Additionally, we're also seeing some regime leaders hunted down and killed on the spot. Talal Dakak, I'm probably mispronouncing that. It's Daqqaq, is one of these. He was just hung in public yesterday or the day before. He's a senior Assad official who was notorious for executing Syrians and feeding prisoners to his pet lions. So not a good person, right? By any stretch of the imagination, but I feel like it's worth highlighting some of this because we're probably going to see more in the coming days where especially senior officials from the Assad regime, again, amnesty for the rank and file soldiers, but when we see some of the guards from the Syria prison, some of the senior leaders within the Assad regime, you should probably expect that they're going to be hunted down and either it's going to be a sham trial, for lack of a better term, or no trial at all before they are publicly executed. Now, there have been some clips of extrajudicial killings coming out of Latakia, where the Turkestan Islamic Party took over just a couple days ago. I believe TIP is fighting alongside / under HTS, but TIP is straight up Al-Qaeda, right? So we'll have debates around when and how much HTS actually shed their affiliations with Al-Qaeda in the past, and what degree that relationship exists today. TIP is an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, right? So they have pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda. It's a bad group, start to finish. They actually have a lot of people in their ranks that have very recent ties to Islamic State. So I wouldn't be too awful shocked, unfortunately, if we see some kind of more brutal tactics emerge in videos and pictures out of the Latakia region here in coming days, which happens to also be where the last remaining Russian airfield is. And look, it's going to be a big question. What does HTS do about this? How do they crack down when some of these more extremist groups start carrying out their own will in portions of Syria they've taken over. It's going to be a big test. We'll have to see how that shakes out. Now, lastly, I just want to say that we have to be very, very careful with a lot of this, for lack of a better term, atrocity footage that's coming out. Everyone right now or a lot of people that I've seen are kind of using it to advance their personal beliefs, and it's very, very messy. So I've already seen quite a few clips of the Turkish-backed SNA killing Kurds in uniform, and is being presented as HTS killing Christian civilians in Damascus. Neither one of those is good. Neither one of those is better or worse than the other. I don't want to go down that route, but if we're going to understand this conflict, we have to work to try to make those distinctions. So just be careful as more and more of this footage comes out. Now, one clear issue facing a future Syria is, will they be in a position to defend their borders and maintain their sovereignty? As in, will they actually control their own territory? Now, it's early right now. The overall cleanup is still very much ongoing, but I do think it's really worth keeping an eye on Israeli military operations that have been carried out in recent days. Now, turning to some official IDF statements here, they say, quote, within the last 48 hours, the IDF struck most of the strategic weapon stockpiles in Syria, preventing them from falling into the hands of terrorist elements. Israeli missile ships struck 2 Syrian naval facilities simultaneously, the Al-Baida port and the Latakia port, where 15 Syrian naval vessels were docked. Dozens of sea-to-sea missiles with ranges of 80 to 190 kilometers were destroyed. Each missile carried significant explosive payloads, posing threats to civilian and military maritime vessels in the area. Manned aircraft flew hundreds of hours over Syrian airspace, conducting over 350 aerial strikes together with fighter jets. There's just no air defense, right? It's complete freedom of maneuver for the Israeli Air Force right now. They say a wide range of targets were struck, including anti-aircraft batteries, Syrian Air Force airfields, and dozens of weapons production sites in Damascus, Homs, Tartus, Latakia, and Palmyra. Numerous strategic weapons were neutralized, including Scud missiles, cruise missiles, surface-to-sea, surface-to-air, and surface-to-surface missiles, UAVs, fighter jets, attack helicopters, radars, tanks, hangars, and more. Look, great. We don't want those falling into the hands of any non-state actor, right? So this is the side of this argument where you can kind of understand Israel sees an opportunity. Again, the airspace, it's a very permissive operating environment for Israeli aircraft right now. They know where a lot of these munition stockpiles are. They're going to destroy them. So whatever comes next, however HTS looks or who they align with going forward, at least Israel doesn't have to deal with these weapons. You might think that is a good move. You might think that is a legal or illegal, justified, unjustified move. It makes sense tactically and strategically for Israel to be doing that. Now, it does sound like Israel has been coordinating with HTS to the point of saying, we are just going after old Syrian military facilities. And there haven't been any accounts that I have seen so far about the IDF engaged in any sort of combat operations or airstrikes against current HTS elements. Now, there has been some talk about the IDF operations on the ground, and this is where I get a little more skeptical about what we're seeing. This one, to me, is a little harder to justify. Now, the IDF has denied reports claiming that Israeli troops are advancing towards Damascus, saying that they are only operating inside the buffer zone on the border between Israel and Syria and the Golan Heights. The IDF's Arabic language spokesperson said, quote, reports circulated in some media outlets claiming that IDF troops are advancing or approaching Damascus are completely incorrect. IDF troops are present inside the buffer zone and at defensive positions close to the border in order to protect the Israeli border. And where that's coming from is a couple different directions. I did see it across a lot of Russian media today, not all that surprising, saying that Israeli forces are advancing on the ground towards Damascus. And then Reuters, actually, citing 2 regional security officials, said that Israeli troops reached Katana, Qatana, and I'll pull up the map here to show where there might be some confusion. They say it's unclear if the report was referring to the Katana district, parts of which are already in the buffer zone, or the town, which is around 25 kilometers from Damascus. So maybe if we give people the benefit of the doubt, they're confusing the two, and either way, the IDF is kind of standing firm that right now they are not going to get involved in operations in Syria and that they're only carrying out defensive operations. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that because Syrian troops had abandoned their positions in this buffer zone, Israel's move into the buffer zone was necessary as a temporary defensive position. But the United Nations, or the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, or UNDOF, kind of pushed back on that. Their spokesperson said the peacekeepers informed the Israeli counterparts that these actions would constitute a violation of the 1974 disengagement agreement, that there should be no military forces or activities in the area of separation. So, look, it's going to be an area of contention probably for a little while here. I'll be very interested to see what the conditions look like on the ground and inside of Syria for Israel to say, got it, and actually move back to their side of that buffer zone. But either way, right now, doesn't look like they're advancing towards Damascus, but they have moved into the eastern portion of that buffer zone into what I believe is technically Syrian territory. Now, a couple different things to watch in coming days. Really going to break this down between external and internal. Externally, we haven't really seen any change from the Russian force posture in the region. Remember, they do still have resources at the Tartus naval base and as well as the Latakia airfield. The Russian naval assets have moved off the coast a little bit. However, it looks like that might have been done just to protect them and be extra safe as Israel was carrying out strikes against the Syrian naval resources there. They also might just be waiting orders to do something else, like evacuate or move to a different location, whatever that might be. We also haven't really seen anything significant from Iran or Turkey over the course of these last couple days, but those two parties do really have quite a bit of leverage, not just in this conflict and in Syria, but across the region in general. I would expect we're going to see more out of both of them before too long. And then turning to the domestic picture, something, of course, we have to watch is HTS is in the process of standing up governance, right? They're putting people in positions to govern the country right now. We're going to wait and we're going to see. We're going to judge them based off their actions, not off their words. And we are starting to see some of those actions take place. But it's not one day, it's not 2 days. It's going to be, can they keep that going long term? And, earlier we were talking about the TIP moving into Latakia. I'm going to be very interested in how HTS handles groups like that are technically on their side. They're in an area where HTS has control, but they're far more extreme than HTS and probably definitely won't give the new Syrian government a good name if they have groups like TIP operating in areas that they are in charge of. Another big one here is in the northeast portion of the country. This is still a divided territory, right? Up there, you still have SNA and SDF portions holding territory of the country. I'm kind of interested to see what that reconciliation will look like. Is that going to be a long-term dividing line, or will HTS find a way to kind of work with these Turkish and then Kurdish elements to find some way to kind of bridge those territories and create one continuous Syria, if you will. It's, easier said than done. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.